the idea of enforcing boundaries and borders and rule of law procedures having to do with immigration are biblical. And not just biblical, but they're biblical because they derive from principles of moral law as well, natural law that's written on the hearts of every image bearer.
The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership between 1615 and Missio Nexus, who have a shared passion to mobilize the people of God to be a part of His mission.
Well, hello and welcome to the Mission Matters podcast. I'm Matthew Ellison, and I'm joined by my good friend and co-host Ted Esler. Ted, greetings, my friend.
Greetings to you, Matthew. It's great to be on the podcast.
Great to be on the podcast. We have an important conversation today. We're going to be talking about immigration, and that is a complicated and confusing subject, especially when immigration is illegal. It elicits a wide range of emotions and reactions, and with Donald Trump preparing to assume his second term in the White House, I think it is a relevant topic for today, just the implications of immigration and missions. So, Ted, why don't you introduce our guest today and get this conversation rolling?
Sure. Yeah, I think this will be a little bit different immigration talk than what you typically hear in global mission circles. We have Alex Kocman on today. He serves as the Director of Communications and Engagement at ABWE. A mission agency I really appreciate and like. I really see an awesome focus on the gospel with ABWE. And Alex is somebody I've followed on Twitter for a while. Shares some strong opinions at times, Alex.
I've been known to.
That's for sure. Could you just tell us a little bit about what your position entails before we jump into the topic at hand?
For sure, and it's great to be here, and it's nice to be on the other side. We've had both of you gentlemen on the Missions podcast here, which is ABWE's flagship missions production, and nice to turn the tables. But here I have the privilege of serving as Director of Communications and Engagement. Also have been serving on our leadership team as well, working closely with our president. But the team and I here have the immense privilege of holding the rope for ABWE's 1,000 missionaries, reaching into almost 90 countries now, by God's grace. And we celebrate and serve missionaries by telling their story across web platforms, across our magazine published since 1929. I think you guys all know that holding the rope doesn't just mean logistics for missionaries on the ground. It also means shining a spotlight on them and allowing other people to find out about what God's doing around the world. So that's what we get to do here, and we're really trying to not only tell stories of individual missionaries, but also tell the greater story of what God's doing in the world and thinking through it biblically. So excited to have this conversation. I don't know who this Trump figure is or what you're even referring to, Matt, or why it's timely, but we'll get into it nonetheless.
That sounds great.
Well, let's just jump right into the deep end. Why don't we do that to get started? So, Alex, give us your thoughts. Is it right or wrong that Trump plans to carry out this mass deportation here in the next 3 or 4 months, probably going into the next couple of years?
Yeah. Well, and of course, this is not something that mission agencies deal with that question too often or directly, right? We're not political entities, we're not lobbyists, but from my personal perspective, I see that as really just returning to the level of deportations that were happening. Statistically, the data bears this out, were happening in the 90s under Bill Clinton, who deported some 10 million illegal aliens in his administration. And so I don't think it would be too radical. I think it appears radical now, given how polarized we are and given the current conditions. And it is interesting, though, the way that we react to the idea of deportation. I think that triggers some of us. We can certainly think of scenarios where it would at least feel or seem or appear unjust, and would there be disruptions to families and businesses? Undoubtedly. At the same time, we have to remember a biblical perspective on justice and on the rule of law, and all things I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, let's zoom out of Bill Clinton did this, or let's talk about kind of the concept of nation states and citizenship. Let's get a little bit more naked. Are these Bible ideas? Are these things that we think are, Christian concepts that we should be embracing?
Mm. Well, I would contend that the idea of enforcing boundaries and borders and rule of law procedures having to do with immigration are biblical. And not just biblical, but they're biblical because they derive from principles of moral law as well, natural law that's written on the hearts of every image bearer. We have both in the Torah and in Proverbs statements to the effect that you should not move the landmark set up by your fathers. You shouldn't play around with property lines. And so we already recognize early on in Scripture that God does respect boundaries. And we find in Acts 17 that God has ordained boundaries for peoples, and he's sovereign over those. And in the context of Acts 17, we also know he's getting the gospel to all of them, right? And that's what we're all considering here in terms of global missions. But going even back further into the Old Testament, you have the Table of Nations in Genesis. And in the Table of Nations, you have statements to the effect that the peoples are apportioned across the world according to their languages, according to their countries and lands that are assigned to them. And so God, it appears in his providence, has ordered the world in such a way that peoples ordinarily dwell together, that borders and boundaries matter. Borders and boundaries matter. And then you add all of that to the moral instruction in the Ten Commandments, not to steal. And there's a great tradition in Protestant thinking and in older thinking going back of recognizing that each of the Ten Commandments is not only what's specifically prescribed, but it also comes with it. There's a whole moral framework. For instance, to not murder means to uphold life in all sorts of different ways, right? There's ways that we apply each of these texts. And I think if we're rightly applying what it means not to steal, it also means we're not going to take advantage or siphon resources away unjustly from any entity, including potentially a nation state. So I know we have this modern notion of a nation state, and we can talk about Westphalia and where that comes from historically, but fundamentally at root, I don't think it's contra-biblical to think about the integrity of modern nations and their borders and the right of civil magistrates to determine procedure and then consequences if someone violates that procedure. And I think what Romans 13 and similar passages do is obligate us to submit to those civil magistrates when they're seeking to carry out their duty in a way that accords with justice.
So, Alex, you mentioned Acts 17, and I know a lot of people, use that verse and they say, look, the mission field is coming to us. Yes, God is sovereign over the movement of peoples. And he's doing it so that some might find him. And so isn't open borders a good thing, bringing the nations to us, bringing the mission field to our own context?
I think what happens is category confusion when we approach it in those ways. And I recognize, I'm sure you gentlemen as well both recognize, the Lord is bringing not only the nations to places like the U.S., but bringing the unreached. And there's missional opportunities that come out of that. One of the things that I love that ABWE's done is we've been able to work with persecuted Afghan Christians who've come to the U.S. who are now serving as missionaries with ABWE, winning Afghan Muslim refugees to Christ. And we're witnessing baptisms, we're witnessing churches planted. So we firmly believe that, yes, there are missionary opportunities opened up by the movements of peoples. But I think we can distinguish types of goods. I think we can distinguish earthly and temporal goods or ills from civil, from spiritual goods or lesser goods. And so what that means for us, practically speaking, is, God uses chaotic events. He uses injustices. He uses breaking of laws all the time for his glory and for the advancement of his mission. And I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think we can apply ourselves intellectually and recognize there are injustices in the civil sphere that those with civil power are obligated to address, while at the same time, God can use those injustices and the state of affairs that we're in for the advance of the gospel, but that doesn't mean that policy is thereby justified. I think we can all look at times in Scripture and in our own lives when unjust or unsustainable things have taken place. God's used it for his glory, and we can participate in that as far as it goes. But that doesn't post facto justify an injustice.
So one of the things so I was at Lausanne. I went to a session led by Rick Warren. And I don't know if you were there or not, Matthew, but Rick said, our church has reached every nation in the world. And, what he means by that is every nation state. Mm. Now, missiologically, for me, that's like whoa, you have not reached every nation, because that's not how we missiologists tend to define nation. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the tensions here, one of the things that I feel in this discussion is so much of my time I'm trying to help people understand the panta ta ethne definition of nation, yet so much of the immigration talk is about the kind of modern nation state idea, which, did not really exist in the day of Jesus. They didn't have nation states the way that we have nation states today. So that is I don't know if it's what you call a paradox, or it's kind of a catch in my craw. Every time I hear somebody really literally apply nation states to the concept of nation that we find in the scriptures. So that'd be one, that's not an argument against what you're saying, because I think your comment that it's not extra biblical to have, immigration law. I agree with that. I mean, did I say that wrong? That topic, in a sense, is extra biblical. It's not addressed. The Bible doesn't say nations should have these laws about immigrants. The other thing I would just say is, I do think, Matthew, in response directly to your question, there's so much hype in the missions community about immigrant ministry, and it's important. Mm-hmm. But Alex's comment that we got to do two things at the same time is key, because we will not reach the unreached through diaspora-focused immigrant ministry. It's just not going to happen. Yeah. If you look at some of the huge people group blocks in northern India, for example, very few of those people will ever leave their village. They won't travel 10 miles away from where they're born their entire lives, let alone, move to New York City or Toronto or Buenos Aires or you name it. So anyway,
I should qualify my question. I was being the provocateur. I work with churches all the time.
Better you than me.
And I always tell them, who has God brought to your context? Yeah. Who are the nations that God has brought to your neighborhood, to your region? But that can't be a replacement for taking the gospel to the ends of the earth, because as you said, you will never reach these unreached peoples if you're only focusing on immigrant, type of mission. So just to put the statement out there, I was being the provocateur there.
So Alex, I'd be curious to know if you are familiar with the Evangelical Immigration Roundtable.
Somewhat.
A couple of their members have said things like, Jesus was an immigrant. And of course, I think there's been some commercials playing on various streaming platforms and television shows talking about the fact that, making the claim anyway, that Jesus was an immigrant. What say ye? Was Jesus an immigrant?
Well, I think that it depends who's saying it. There may be a mixture of motives behind the statement. You have the fact that Jesus spends time in Egypt with his family escaping Herod and later returns. And so there is a certain sense in which you can say, okay, Jesus goes through a period of his childhood where he's what we might call a displaced person within the confines of the Roman Empire in his day. And perhaps there's things we can draw upon there. There's other things that Scripture says that God has his eye on the sojourner as well. You have the encounter with Hagar. God is the God who sees. So he sees the plight of those who are truly without a homeland, sojourners, wanderers. And there's much in Scripture about God's compassion towards such individuals. But I do think it's often disingenuous how we want to simply take whatever the political cause is or whatever cause we're trying to advocate and cram that into the story of Jesus' life, his earthly ministry, and use that as moral justification for whatever point we want to make about immigration today. Because the reality is, Jesus was a law-observant Jew in Judea and in Nazareth and operating in his ministry in Judea. And because of that, he obeyed the law, not only the Jewish law, but he was a godly citizen. He obeyed the laws of his day and time. He wasn't taking advantage, for instance, of an asylum system. And so nowadays, we don't often distinguish well between legal or illegal migration or immigration. It's all sort of wrapped up in this just fuzzy concept of migrants. And I'd love to disentangle that in our understanding. I think we all need to, because Jesus was not a violator of one of the laws with respect to migration in his day. I think it's disingenuous, oftentimes, the way it's presented, that claim.
Alex, I'm mindful of a story that a friend of mine shared with me. He was based in Phoenix for years, and he had an organization called Phoenix 1040 Interface, because a lot of refugee settlement happened in the valley there in Phoenix. And he was reaching out to those who were legally here, but he was also reaching out to those who were illegally here. It just, he didn't discriminate. He just shared the gospel with people that were in his sphere of influence. And he got a letter, I believe. No, it was a phone call from a Christian woman who just berated him and just said, when our country falls apart, I'm going to hold you responsible. I know that's an extreme situation, but are you at all concerned about Christians conflating politics and faith in a way that leads to a worldview that is more American than it is biblical?
I wouldn't couch it in those terms, Matt, but I am concerned, just like on the one side where there's only walking without chewing gum. I'm concerned about chewing gum without walking, right? So there is a version of the immigration conversation that only wants to say the nations are coming to us, missions, full stop, end of story, and not recognize, well, is it just what's happening in terms of trafficking, what's happening to children at the border, the cartel activity, bringing 15 to 20 million people into a country with really nowhere to put them, no plan for them to assimilate and to thrive. Is that just? Would it be just for me to host 300 people around my dinner table? No, that wouldn't be loving my family or my guests well. I think those same ethical arguments about hospitality apply. And so there's challenges that I would make to that side of the conversation. The challenge that I would make to others with a more conservative posture on immigration issues would be simply not to let your love grow cold. And letters like the one that woman wrote, there's more than one person in the country who likely feels that way. And that's where we as Christians also come in to say, these are image bearers of God. We have a government that right now is simultaneously saying it's illegal to cross this border, but also come on over and we'll sign you up for various subsidies and programs and we'll house you. And so there's mixed messaging coming from the top, federally speaking. To what degree do you blame the individuals that come in under those conditions? I think that's a valid conversation to have. The law itself is sending multiple contradictory messages, but we have to challenge individuals who are our friends not to let their love grow cold and to recognize, okay, a person is a criminal who's crossed the border illegally, north or south, regardless of their national background. They've violated the clear rule of law. I think it's displeasing to the Lord. And what does that mean? But that they're a sinner in need of hearing the gospel of salvation. I mentioned one of those Afghan migrants who ABWE is working with, who was a believer in the underground church there, who's now ministering to Muslims. Well, one of the individuals that he's come into contact through ministry, more than one, I'm sure, of course, but one story I'm aware of is of an illegal immigrant here who came to the U.S., heard the gospel here from one of these Afghan church leaders. And a part of the discipleship process is, as you're walking with the Lord now as a believer, newly converted, you realize, okay, I may have sinned in violating the law and doing something that was in my personal interest, but not respecting the system around me. Those are discipleship conversations that we can have. Those that are here illegally need the gospel. And again, this is where I think the church needs to be the church and government needs to be the government. But let me just add one thought, if you don't mind, and I don't want to hijack here at all. But I really resonate with what you both reflected on earlier. Diaspora ministry alone is not going to get the gospel to every isolated, unreached, unengaged people group. That's just not how it works. We can't expect people to simply come here. We still have to go and tell. And I think sometimes these lines of argument that simplistically say, well, let's celebrate the nations are coming here, or Jesus himself was a refugee as well, full stop, end of story. It not only runs the risk of thinking that people are sort of excused from going to these far off places. Really what I think it does in a perverse way is it replaces the Great Commission mandate of the church with a policy of the government allowing people to come here. In effect, it's exporting the role of foreign missions to state actors, similar to the way in which we've sort of forgotten our obligation to the poor, and we trust government programs to do a lot of that for us. The church has been derelict in its duty to the poor in many ways. I think we do the same thing with missions when we said, well, instead of us going, we're just going to let the state take care of bringing a lot of people here, and maybe they'll hear the gospel and be saved through osmosis just by being here. I'm not sure how that works, but I think that we have to watch the motives that can creep in.
Alex, you're actually touching on some missiological issues that I think have been rising to the surface in the last couple of years surrounding unreached people group ministry and also place. And a number of evangelical leaders have said, hey, we can't lose the idea of place when we talk about the Great Commission. And I kind of come out of that whole Ralph Winter or that philosophy of unreached people groups that's really strong. So my first reaction is it's never about place. But then when you start looking at the biblical language, it's going, it's sending, there's movement there. There's more than just, absorbing the people that are coming your way. You'll hear people talk about the Great Commission is a as you are going command, even though that relies just on one Great Commission passage, and there's plenty of others in which you see this kind of active movement. So I do think these are good questions for us to be asking in this current globalized world where we're saying that place is irrelevant. I'm starting to lean more toward agreeing with those that are calling for this idea of place in the Great Commission.
Place matters so much in our own ministry. I serve as an elder in our church. I mean, our local context matters. We're having strategic conversations about outreach, and should we reach out to our near neighbors when most of the church members are driving 20 or 30 minutes to get here, or should we focus on their neighbors, not the neighborhood next to the church building? I mean, place always matters. I think modernity has alienated us from place, and I think what that does is predispose us to overlook the importance of place in these missiological conversations. I agree. I'm leaning the way that you are, Ted, with that as well. I'm against most simplistic definitions of ethnos or of nation. Yeah. I think ethno-linguistic people groups, that's a helpful marker. And certainly Winter and others have given us that over time. But I do think that nation is a constellation of ethnicity, language, religion, culture, self-conception. Do they have a word for themselves together as a people? One of the stars in that constellation might be, hey, do they govern themselves? Do they have borders that you can draw around them? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But once you start realizing that a nation is sort of the amalgamation of all of these concepts, then you can recognize, yeah, there's ethno-linguistic people groups that transcend national boundaries. But then there's also something real and distinct about what it means to be American that's different from what it means to be Canadian or Mexican. Same can be said for other nation states that we would locate across the world. And so I'm against the simplicity and the reductionism of these things. As to that question of open borders themselves, I think openness has been the posture of our culture for a few generations now. And I think that justice and love and other biblical terms are better foundations to build a society on. Openness is a modern value, and I think it leads to the deracification of our missiology, our theology, and our political philosophy.
Yeah. I think if we look to Paul, we see peoples and places. His focus included both, and I've really leaned into that as well. I'm working with the church in Roanoke right now, and they're wanting to engage an ethno-linguistic unreached people group, and so they're focusing on that barrier. But they're also working with an ethno-religious barrier with another area, which really is place related as opposed to language related. So I really love that. So Alex, as we begin to land this airplane here today, there may be a few other questions Ted wants to ask as well, but I want to know if you have any suggestions how Christians might love their illegal immigrant neighbor while respecting the laws of our governing authorities. Maybe you could just give some insights. Practically, what does that look like? Because again, I know it stirs up so much emotion for some people. They probably need some next steps.
Well, when I look at the New Testament and the letters of Paul, he's really good at making application. And I think a lot of evangelical pastors, I think we're afraid to make direct application. Paul says, all right, now to the fathers and the husbands and the wives and the children and the masters and the slaves. And he goes on down the line through every stratum of society. And I think if Paul were to target his feedback at some in a place like the U.S. today, first of all, I think it's incumbent on Christian employers not to reinforce systems of injustice by paying people illegally under the table less than what's permitted legally with minimum wage and all of those sorts of things. Because the reality is this is not strictly a right-left issue. There is this unspoken status quo between left and right, where the left permits illegal immigration because of certain political objectives. The right permits it for certain labor and economic reasons as well. It's cheap labor coming in, oftentimes comparable to slave labor in some cases. And so really, I think we have to take those biblical application barrels and turn them and face them on both sides of the aisle in order to say, Christians should be operating, especially those that employ others, those that are involved in housing projects in the U.S. and in various cities, and certainly those with political authority, need to make sure that they're representing a full-orbed biblical view of justice, which means enforcing existing laws. It also means looking at biblically what true love is. I made this case earlier, but if I'm bringing in hundreds of people into my home and seating them around my dining room table, I'm not loving them, nor am I loving my family who would normally be seated around that table. In the name of loving all of them, I've in fact shown love to none of them. And so I think we need to speak to Christian employers, Christian civil magistrates to behave in a just way. And then secondarily, and this is maybe where we could park for a little bit, is thinking through the way love demonstrates itself. It does demonstrate itself in an orderly fashion in these concentric spheres, right? We know biblically, if you don't provide for your own household, you're worse than an unbeliever. Jesus even warns missionaries, the Pharisees. He says, don't cross land and sea to make a single proselyte if you're going to make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. And so biblically, there's certain things that I need to get right before I can think about going to the nations, loving the nations, serving them, as important as that is. So is my own house in order? Am I loving my near neighbors, those that are like me and those that are unlike me? Am I loving my church family, my extended family? And then what can I do to bring Christ out to those who've never heard in faraway places and in under-engaged languages? And so I think reordering how we think about mission, how we think about outreach, recognizing the order of loves, I think can help us and can guide us and can help us sidestep some of these very simplistic arguments that are made on either side that just rely on this surface level of rhetoric.
Well, let's wrap up. Before we do, I want to ask you a question, Alex, about the book you wrote this past year, Striving for the Faith. I had a chance to read it. Awesome treatment of the book of Philippians. Is that book released at this point and out?
Well, Ted, first, thanks for blurbing it. Appreciate that a lot and for your support. And it's out on pre-order right now, and we'll begin filling orders from Founders Press in February.
Okay. All right. So be looking for that coming up. Our guest today again was Alex Kocman. You can look up ABWE on the internet. It's a great organization. If you're thinking about going, they'd be one you want to check out as a potential sending organization. So, Alex, thanks for being with us.
Thank you both. Appreciate everything that you're doing for the Lord in both of your respective organizations. And it's a great conversation. Let's have more meaningful conversations like this in the missions community.
Before you go, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership of 1615 and Missio Nexus. Check out 1615.org and missionexus.org for more resources on the mission of God and the matters of the mission. The Mission Matters podcast is hosted by Matthew Ellison, president of 1615, and Ted Esler, president of Missio Nexus.